Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Part 3, Chapter 3, Part 1. Subsection 1. "Why have doctors' waiting rooms always got such thick carpets?" asked Neville, genially, so soon as it was plain to him that the manservant was gone, and that there was no one else in the room beside Algy, who had brought him. By this time he could not see at all beyond just being able to distinguish the difference between light and darkness, although it was now only Friday, and darkness had first fallen as they finished shooting on Tuesday. It was still all new enough to be interesting, now that he was quite sure that there was no organic injury to his seeing apparatus, and yet it appeared to him that an almost incalculable time had passed. The first night and morning had been the worst. Aunt Anna had come to him 5 minutes after the doctor had left, and had told him his verdict. She had done it quite admirably. She had not been in the least dramatic or over-tender. She had simply begun, "My poor dear," in an extraordinarily natural tone, and had then told him, still genially, that it was entirely his own fault for not having gone again to a man in London, that Dr. Mackenzie had assured her that there was no organic injury to the eyes, but that the headaches were responsible. The headaches, therefore, must be looked to at once, and he must just be content to be in the dark, in every sense of the word, for a few hours. She had, with Dr. Mackenzie's consent, wired for an oculist and proposed to send the car to London, if Neville approved, the first thing in the morning, to bring the oculist back. Meantime, she proposed to come and dine with him in his room, and show him how not to put his spoon and fork into his nose and ears. The guests must just take care of themselves. That, then, had been scene 1. The hours that followed had certainly been very oppressive, particularly as his head had ached again, though not as acutely as before. Waking in the morning was rather bad, as, though he could hear the birds under the eaves, he had been able to make out no more than dim oblongs where the windows ought to be, so soon as Charlson, who had slept in the bathroom, pulled back the curtains at his command and assured him that it was 7:30. Besides, in spite of himself, he had nourished a hope that somehow or other he would be able to see again, just as usual, after a night's rest. He had 1 or 2 spurts of impatience at breakfast in bed, when Aunt Anna had looked in an hour ago, especially when he dropped a spoonful of porridge and milk just inside his pyjama jacket. It seemed to him that Charlson was really rather clumsy not to have prevented that. His cigarette, too, was disappointing. It tasted precisely like brown paper. After breakfast, Algy had come up and sat on the bed, which was annoying, and Maresfield had come in later to say goodbye, carrying a cigar, and he particularly disliked the smell of a cigar in his bedroom. He said to Aunt Anna with some bitterness afterwards that it reminded him of a commercial traveller. The oculist had arrived about noon, and when Neville heard the tread of his feet on the threshold and Aunt Anna's genial, "May we come in?" for a moment the ironical ill-humour with which he had deliberately tried to hide his interior apprehensiveness had deserted him. He felt very helpless and rather frightened, because really a good deal depended on what this new man said. He had gathered that, generally, from Aunt Anna's remarks, and yet he was not sure how she had conveyed it. There followed a very uncomfortable quarter of an hour. The oculist first asked him a number of questions, and then proceeded, as Neville would have said, to pull him about. He had to sit very upright, with pillows packed behind him, and to open his eyes wide. There followed disconcerting flashes of light, the grip of rather cold, dry fingers about his temples, palms of hands laid on his forehead. Aunt Anna was in the room too, all the while, and he did not like this. It made him feel rather like a child. There then followed some more questions, and then a little silence. "Aunt Anna?" "Yes, my dear," came her quiet voice from a position much closer to him than he had expected. "I want you to go downstairs, please. I'll send Mr. Browing down as soon as he's done with me." Then, He was perfectly certain that she and the doctor were exchanging glances, and he felt infuriated. Before he could speak again, she had answered him. "Very well," she said. He heard the door close. "Mrs. Fanning's gone?"
"Yes, Sir Neville,"
came the steady voice. "Well, what's the matter with me?" His lips and throat felt curiously dry.
"I really can't quite tell yet, Sir Neville. I can only assure you that there's no organic injury at all."
"That's good news, is it?"
"The very best. I do not mean for a moment that the thing may not be serious, but what I do mean is that there is no injury to the instrument itself. It is perfectly sound."
"Then what in the world is the matter? Why can't I—"
"One moment, Sir Neville. I say that there is no injury that I can detect, but it appears to me almost certain that there is some pressure upon the optic nerves. The nerves, you know, that connect the eye with the brain. The wire, if I may say so, is clogged in some way. It is not in itself injured, nor is the retina."
"What's the next thing to do, then?" snapped the young man, a little peevishly. It seemed to him that this man was unnecessarily wordy.
"The next thing is to consult a head specialist. He will be able to give you a first-rate opinion as to the cause of this pressure, and to advise you how it may be removed. What you have told me about your headaches—"
"I see. Then you've done your job?"
"Well, I have detected that there is no job for me to do. Mrs. Fanning tells me that the doctor here has recommended Sir Arthur Handsworth. You could go to no better man. Dr. Mackenzie is downstairs. I will have a word with him again, if I may."
It seemed a very long while before Aunt Anna came back, and she did not seem quite so exultant as Neville had expected. She was quite quiet and controlled. She said that so far the news was good, but scarcely more. She then said that she was sending a note by the car, straight up to Sir Arthur, asking for an appointment. "I suppose I'd better go at once," remarked Neville, with a detached manner.
"My dear, of course you must. We'll all go up together."
It was later in the afternoon, after they had received the answer that Sir Arthur Handsworth would be happy to receive them on Friday morning at 12 o'clock, that Neville announced to Aunt Anna that she was not to accompany him to the surgeon. "You mustn't think me brutal," he had said, "but I must have it out alone."
"But, my dear, you won't be able to—"
"I've asked Algy to come up with us, and to go with me on Friday morning. You'll be at Elizabeth Street, and when we come back we'll all have lunch together, and then, if this man has taken away the pressure on what's-his-name, we'll all go to the zoo. That's much better. Please, Aunt Anna, I really mean it." After an instant's silence, she had said simply that it should be so. Here, then, on Friday morning, at 5 minutes to 12, sat Neville and Algy in 2 armchairs in the room that had the thick carpet, and Aunt Anna was waiting for them in Elizabeth Street, where they had arrived in time for dinner last night. Subsection 2.
"It's to deaden the shrieks,"
said Algy in answer. Neville laughed, a short bark. "You're a cheering chap," he said. Algy felt as much bewildered and out of his element as such a man always must feel under such circumstances, and, equally characteristically of his type, he bore himself most suitably. Without actually expressing it to himself, he felt that any change of manner might really alarm his friend. He felt it to be far better, as indeed it was, to behave as usual. "Now, tell me all about the room," said Neville. "I hear a clock. Is it black marble? It sounds portly, somehow."
"Well, you're wrong. It's Empire and extremely good. It is also observing that we are 5 minutes early. I told you so."
"Go on about the room," said Sir Neville. "Pictures? Engravings?"
"There's a Burns-Jones over the clock, a Johnny in armour with a horse. There are large engravings on the other walls, with very wide borders. The carpet—"
"I bet it's red."
"Well, you'd lose. It's chiefly black and yellow."
"Chairs? Mahogany?"
"No, walnut. At least, I think so. You're on the wrong tack, old man. It isn't early Victorian, you know."
"Go on. What colour's the paper?"
"It looks like Spanish leather, but I bet it isn't.
What's on the table? Graphic? Times? Well, the Tatler's on top, and I can see a corner of Country Life. What's the view out of the window? Well, I can see a terracotta sort of house, rather rich. It's at the corner of the street. There's a cat on the balcony. Over the side, there's a little green and white shanty. There's a car. That's enough. By the way, what time's lunch? I think Mrs. Fanning said past. That's all right. We shall be in loads of time. I suppose this chap won't want to do the job bang off? If he does, I think I shall— He stopped short as, to his strained and listening ears, there vibrated a step outside. Then the door opened softly, and a discreet voice spoke. "Will you come this way, sir?" When Algy came back to the comfortable room with the black and yellow turkey carpet, and the Tatler, and the Empire clock 2 minutes later, he was trembling a little. Yet he had seen nothing that was not pleasant and reassuring. He had gripped Neville by the arm as he rose, and led him after the servant. He could hear him breathing as they went. They came out into the comfortable little hall through which they had passed on their first arrival, and turned to the right. A man in a coat not yet buttoned was picking up his hat and gloves from the black oak table by the stairs. Plainly he had just come out from the specialist's room. He did not look at all alarmed or upset, and eyed the stiffly walking figure of Neville with interest. They went on through the hall towards a half-opened door, which the servant pushed wider, himself stepping back to let them go in. As they entered, a tallish man with rather kind, narrow grey eyes, in a frock coat and grey trousers, clean-shaven except for little grey whiskers by his ears, was standing by a knee-hole table from which, plainly, he had just risen. He bowed a little as the door closed almost noiselessly behind them. "Sir Neville Fanning?" Neville put out his hand rather awkwardly. The other made haste to take it. Then Algy steered his friend into a deep padded armchair, indicated in silence by the surgeon. The surgeon then nodded at him, again in silence. "Well, I'll be going, old man," said Algy. "I'll be in the waiting room." Neville too nodded, without speaking, and Algy went out once more. What in the world then was he frightened at? There had been absolutely nothing in the room in the least suggestive, to a layman's eyes at any rate, of anything in the least approaching disease or death or pain. There had been a tall, narrow bookshelf in the little room. There had been a deep carpet, as in here. The fireplace had been just ordinary, with bright fire irons and a little fire. There had been just a curtained doorway at the other end of the room that might, conceivably, lead to some other sort of consulting room. The presence of the inhabitant of that room, too, had been strong and kindly. Yet Algy was undoubtedly frightened. He supposed that it was because it was his first visit to such a place. He had never realized till now how very fond he was of his friend. Up to now, he had taken him for granted, rather, ever since school days. He went down every now and then to stay at Hartley. He had been sincerely grieved over Neville's catastrophe in the summer, but until now he had had no idea that beneath the genial bantering with which he treated Neville, there was anything that could be called deep affection. He would have thought, in fact, that such an emotion would have been rather weak and sentimental. Yet, having faced that surgeon, side by side with his friend, he was conscious that his own sentiment, at any rate, was not weak. It was there, anyhow. So he sat down again, pulled the Tatler towards him, and only just caught himself in time beginning to bite his nails. The Tatler of September the 28th seemed to him a singularly poor number. On the front page was a large picture of a very stupid-looking royalty, of the greatest possible importance, with a row of 5 pearls round a well-polished neck. There was not much comfort there. She, at any rate, had never sat in a surgeon's waiting room waiting for a verdict on somebody else. On the next page, under the heading "In Town and About," were first 2 pictures of girls' faces, framed as if they were miniatures, and inscriptions underneath. He read one carefully through. The lady was Miss Alexandra Bennet. She was the youngest daughter of some old fool, and was going to be married next Tuesday to the Honourable Carvel Compton, of the Grenadiers, in the Guards' Chapel, Wellington Barracks. That wasn't much good. The marriage couldn't come off anyhow if, on the previous Friday, she had had the inside of her head examined by a kind-looking man in a room with a curtained doorway at the back. The third picture on the page represented the departure of the Dowager Queen of Spain's aunt from Victoria Station. Foolish men stood about the carriage, bareheaded, with a crick in their backs. He began to turn the pages in despair. The letterpress was, of course, out of the question, but he stared meditatively at a number of pictures. There was a champion golfer with his legs terribly twisted and a cigarette in his mouth. Apparently he had just driven a ball. Dim persons in straw hats, looking like dummies, formed the background. There were 2 white dogs resembling crumpled wool hats with their tongues hanging out. There was an American actor with a very long stick and very long legs, photographed in company with an American actress whose name Algy remembered as having been connected with a cause célèbre. There were 4 people in a white motor car, all looking very ugly because their faces were screwed up against the sunlight, who bore distinguished names. There were some political skits, one representing Mr. Asquith as a scullery maid washing up a saucepan with a significant word printed upon it, and another Mr. Redmond crowing like a very small cock on a very large dunghill, labelled Coalition, and so on. Finally came some Elliman's advertisements. Algy tossed it from him in despair. Then he began to walk up and down the room. Fortunately there was a thick carpet. Oh, yes, the poor old chap had said that, first thing after the man had gone out. What a time they were, in there! He looked at the Empire clock. It marked 7 minutes past 12 only. By 25 minutes past 12, Algy took up country life, convinced that the worst must have happened, though he could form no conjecture at all as to what the worst might be. It struck him as very odd that there was no one else in the waiting room, until he became even further depressed by the guess that perhaps the oculist and the Harley doctor had written about the case, and informed Sir Arthur that it would be a long business. He began gallantly at country life, but suddenly laid it down again, because the corner of the hall in the seat of Silas Mond, Esquire, in the county of Westmoreland, reminded him of another corner of a hall in the seat of Sir Neville Fanning, Baronet, in the county of Sussex. He felt as if he had been stung in the middle of his mind. Then he determined to begin a study of the pictures round the room, and began with the Johnny in Armour. It appeared to him unconvincing, and he moved on to the next. This was of a small girl in a large bonnet, and he wondered why on earth such a repellent and simpering face should have been selected by any artist for immortality. He was moving on to the next when his heart leapt and stood still. There was the vibration of a step outside. Then a hand was laid on the handle of the door, and he heard a firm voice speaking. It struck him as a good omen. Surely no one could speak so resolutely and loudly if there were any bad news about. The door opened, and the surgeon looked in. "Mr. Lennox?" He could not speak. "Sir Neville has just got his things on. Would you give him your arm to the car, or would you prefer—" He was out and in the hall without a word. Neville was coming towards him, led by the sleek and discreet servant. Algy moved the man aside and himself took his place. He remembered as they approached the hall door to nod to Sir Arthur, but no more. "4 steps down," he said. They crossed the pavement. The car was drawn up, and Paul made haste to open the door. "Mind the step up," said Algy. He tucked the rug round his friend as Paul went round to the front. Then he could wait no longer. "Well, old man?" Neville hesitated. "Got to go through with it," he said. "He says, Operation as soon as possible. It's pretty bad." The motor began to throb violently.